Enjoying a very strong coffee. It's early morning and a good cup of coffee is required. But is our traditional picker-upper in danger of becoming a luxury as prices soar? Well, like other foods, the cost of coffee has gone through the roof. On international markets, the price of coffee, especially Arabica, has seen dramatic increases, in some cases going up by 70%.
Pound of coffee beans. Farmers need to harvest more than 1,500 of these cherries. Each one contains 2 seeds that will be sorted, processed, and roasted before they reach your cup. In 2022, the average US price for a pound of coffee was $5.89. But there's a specialty category called single origin coffee that can easily cost over.
And a lot of people drink coffee, but what most people don't know is that the birthplace of coffee is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a long history of cultivating and exporting high quality coffee beans. Coffee production is the largest export earner for Ethiopia, accounting for around 30% of the country's total export earnings. And coffee is a major source of employment for millions of Ethiopians. While Ethiopia exports a lot of other resources.
Ever paid $26 for a bag of coffee? What if I told you the farmer who grew it earned less than 10 cents? This is Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee, where farmers grow some of the world's finest beans. But most of them live on less than $1 a day, trapped in poverty because of the global unfair pricing. But one man decided to fight back. Meet Dedis Meskela, the coffee king of Ethiopia. He created a system where farmers sell directly to the buyers, cutting out the middleman, and farmers making 4x on their coffee. Because of him, farmers now build schools.
Ethiopia earns over $650 million selling this product. Ethiopia earned over $674 million from coffee exports in the first 4 months of the fiscal year, surpassing its target by 127%. Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority said exports reached 150,346 tons. Compared to last year, exports increased by 62,587 tons.
The morning sun rose over Addis Ababa like a promise written in gold. The air smelled of roasted beans and fresh rain, and the hills around the capital shimmered under a thin mist. On the surface, it was a normal day in the city that loved coffee more than air. But inside the Ethiopian Ministry of Trade, something extraordinary was unfolding, a deal that would ripple across continents, bend old loyalties, and infuriate the most powerful man on earth. In a quiet conference room, under a dome of soft light, Ethiopia's trade minister, a tall man with sharp eyes, sat across from the Brazilian ambassador. Between them lay a simple document, a memorandum of understanding, printed on cream paper. It was only a few pages long, but what it represented was revolutionary. The minister leaned forward. "This agreement isn't just about coffee," he said. "It's about sovereignty. For too long, we've let middlemen define the price of our work. We plant, we pick, we roast, and someone else decides what it's worth." The ambassador nodded, and Brazil understands that better than anyone. We've been slaves to market indexes for too long. But if we combine Ethiopia's origin and Brazil's processing power, we control the entire vertical. Outside, the city moved to the rhythm of honking horns and morning chatter. But inside, silence hung heavy. The minister signed his name, then passed the pen. When the ambassador's signature touched the page, the world's largest coffee alliance was born, a South-South partnership that bypassed the United States, Europe, and the commodity markets that had long dictated global coffee prices. News of the deal broke slowly, at first only mentioned in trade circles, but within hours, the story spread across global media. Ethiopia and Brazil sign historic coffee alliance. Beneath the headlines, analysts scrambled to understand what it meant. Most missed the real story. It wasn't about beans, it was about power. In Washington, the situation was anything but calm. By midday, the president's economic team gathered in the Oval Office. A briefing paper lay on the resolute desk, stamped with the words urgent, coffee market disruption. The president read the first paragraph, his face tightening. They did what? The advisor cleared his throat. "Sir, Ethiopia and Brazil have formed a joint export and pricing framework. They're bypassing the U.S. commodity exchange. The new model eliminates traditional American intermediaries. So we're cut out?" Completely. The president leaned back in his chair, fuming. "Do you know how much American farmers depend on that export network? Coffee might be small potatoes for Wall Street, but it's livelihoods for people back home." The advisor hesitated. "With respect, sir, they're about to flood the market with premium beans at half the usual markup. That's going to destroy margins for U.S. coffee importers." The president slammed his hand on the desk. "Find out who. Let this happen." But no one in the room could answer that. The truth was, the world had changed. For decades, the United States controlled agricultural commodities through pricing, logistics, and finance. But now, Ethiopia and Brazil were rewriting the rules, a farmer-led rebellion against old hierarchies. In Addis Ababa, celebrations erupted quietly. Local coffee cooperatives, once strapped in debt cycles, suddenly found themselves negotiating contracts directly with Brazilian distributors. Payment terms improved, profits soared, and pride returned to the countryside. In the town of Yirgacheffe, where some of the world's finest beans grew on misty slopes, farmers gathered around a radio crackling with static. The announcer's voice came through faintly. Ethiopia and Brazil have formed a coffee alliance to secure fair trade and eliminate exploitation by foreign intermediaries. The farmers looked at one another, stunned. An old man removed his hat and smiled. "We are finally free," he whispered. Meanwhile, in São Paulo, the Brazilian Coffee Board called an emergency press conference. "This partnership will redefine global trade," said the board's director. "We are establishing a southern supply chain for the South by the South." Reporters peppered him with questions. "Are you provoking Washington?" He smiled. "We're just brewing our own future." That afternoon, Wall Street analysts held their own emergency meeting. Commodity traders stared at red numbers sliding across screens. Futures markets shuddered as the Brazil-Ethiopia alliance announced a unified pricing mechanism denominated not in dollars, but in a mixed currency basket of yuan, real, and birr. That was the real bombshell. By rejecting the dollar as their settlement currency, the two nations had struck at the heart of the American financial system. The shockwaves traveled instantly. The U.S. Treasury called it economic self-harm, but the world called it innovation. In the coffee shops of Addis Ababa, patrons joked that the brew now tasted a little sweeter. But in Washington, bitterness filled the air. The president appeared on television, his expression tight. "We believe in free and fair trade," he said. "But when nations collude to manipulate prices and exclude the U.S. from global markets, we will respond." It was a threat wrapped in diplomacy, but everyone heard the fury beneath. Behind the scenes, the State Department scrambled to contain the fallout. Envoys were dispatched to both Addis Ababa and, carrying veiled warnings, "Reconsider this partnership," they urged. "It's not in your best interest." But Ethiopia's prime minister refused to bend. In a televised address, he said, "For years, our coffee has traveled the world, but our farmers remained poor. We are not rejecting anyone, we are reclaiming ourselves." The words ignited something deep in the hearts of millions across Africa and Latin America. They had heard speeches like this before, but this one came backed with action. In the United States, news channels fumed. Anchors accused Brazil of betrayal and Ethiopia of falling under foreign influence, but no amount of shouting could reverse the momentum. The South had found its rhythm, and the world was dancing to a new tune. Inside the headquarters of the Ethiopian Coffee and Tea Authority, a small team worked late into the night. They were mapping out logistics for the new supply chain: air freight to Rio de Janeiro, shipping routes to Asia, and a digital trading platform co-developed with Brazilian engineers. One of them, a young analyst, looked up from his laptop. "Do you realize what we've done?" he said. "For the first time in history, we're setting the price of our own coffee." His supervisor smiled. "It took a century, but yes, we've taken back the cup." The first shipment left Djibouti port 3 weeks later, 5 massive containers marked with both Ethiopian and Brazilian flags. As they sailed toward Santos, social media exploded with photos and hashtags. Hashtag Coffee Revolution, hashtag South Strong, hashtag Brewed in Freedom. When the shipment reached Brazil, a festival erupted. Local farmers, politicians, and workers celebrated together, holding mugs high under strings of lights. It wasn't just a trade deal, it was the birth of an identity. But thousands of miles away, in Iowa, the mood was grim. At a small-town diner, American coffee producers watched the news in disbelief. The anchor's voice was somber. Analysts predict major losses for U.S. coffee importers as Brazil and Ethiopia bypass traditional markets. Prices for American farmers could collapse. An older farmer slammed his cup on the counter. "We helped build those markets," he growled, "and now they're locking us out." A younger one shook his head. "It's not about us anymore. It's about control. They don't want our beans. They want independence." As global headlines multiplied, the U.S. agricultural lobby went into overdrive. Press conferences, lobbying efforts, and late-night calls to Congress filled the following weeks. "We can't afford to lose another market," warned one powerful lobbyist. "First energy, now agriculture. What's next?" But the tide had already turned. In Geneva, during a tense session of the World Trade Organization, Ethiopian and Brazilian diplomats stood shoulder to shoulder, defending their right to trade freely. "We are not breaking the rules," said Ethiopia's delegate. "We are rewriting them." The chamber fell silent. Outside, protesters waved signs reading "Fair trade is our right." Reporters jostled for sound bites, but the message was clear: the era of dependence was ending. In a backroom interview, a Brazilian economist explained the real secret behind the alliance. "It's not just about coffee," she said. "It's about leverage. When two major producers control price and distribution, they control narrative. Washington has done it for decades. Now it's our turn." In Washington, late-night meetings grew tense. Intelligence reports indicated that other nations, Colombia, Vietnam, Kenya, were considering joining the new network. "It's spreading like wildfire," one CIA analyst warned. "If this becomes a global coffee bloc, we lose more than money. We lose influence." The president frowned. "What's our play? Sanctions?" suggested one aide. "On coffee?" The president scoffed. "We'll look ridiculous." He paused, then added darkly, "Find me leverage, anything. I don't care what it takes." But leverage was exactly what the United States no longer had. Meanwhile, the alliance between Ethiopia and Brazil deepened. Scientists collaborated on sustainable farming, universities exchanged students, and both countries launched a joint research institute focused on agro-innovation. Even their currencies began to stabilize against the dollar as trade volume soared. In rural Ethiopia, coffee cooperatives expanded, new roads were built, and young people returned to farms once abandoned. In Sao Paulo, a new roasting plant opened, co-owned by Ethiopian and Brazilian investors. Its slogan, painted in bold letters, read, "From the highlands to the heartland." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Back in Washington, the president held a private meeting with U.S. trade advisors. "We've got to stop this before it becomes a trend," he said. "If Africa and South America start trading directly, we're out of the picture." An advisor responded carefully, "Sir, with respect, they already have. This isn't about stopping it anymore, it's about surviving it." The president's expression hardened. "Not on my watch." And as he left the room, the world outside continued to change quietly, inexorably, like the steady drip of coffee filling a pot that no one had realized was still brewing. The world was still waking up when the headlines flashed across screens. Ethiopia and Brazil rewrite global coffee trade. By noon, panic had spread from commodity floors in Chicago to embassy corridors in Washington. The ticker scrolled red, the markets bled green, and somewhere inside the West Wing a storm was gathering. The president paced the Oval Office, tie loose, eyes darting between advisors. "Tell me it's exaggerated," he snapped. "Tell me Ethiopia didn't just nationalize our caffeine." No one answered. The Secretary of Agriculture cleared his throat. "Sir, it's not nationalization, it's partnership. They've built a shared export network. No dollars involved. Prices fixed through the Southern Commodity Platform funded by Brazil's Banco do Sul." The president stared at him. "So they built their own stock exchange for coffee?" "Essentially, yes, sir. And they've invited Tanzania, Uganda, and even Vietnam to join." The president turned toward the window, watching the rain streak the glass like slow tears. "They're forming a bloc over beans, and we're supposed to believe this isn't political." A murmur rippled through the room. No one wanted to say the word out loud: de-dollarization. In the rural Midwest, the consequences were already hitting home. Fields that once fed the world now sat in anxious silence. Coffee traders, soy growers, exporters, they all felt the tremor. On a small farm in Nebraska, a man named Russ Wilder tossed a newspaper onto the table. The headline read, "Southern Alliance breaks dollar's grip." His wife poured coffee imported, suddenly expensive, and said quietly, "Maybe it's time we started growing something else." In Addis Ababa, the air felt electric. Streets buzzed with celebration. Radio stations played patriotic songs, offered free cups of the new Freedom Blend. The deal with Brazil wasn't just a trade agreement. It was a declaration of dignity. Prime Minister Emmanuel Beckel watched the city from his office balcony. "Do you hear it?" he asked his economic advisor. "That sound?" The advisor smiled. "It's the sound of a nation waking up." Beckel nodded. "For years they told us our coffee was world-class, yet we earned the least. Now we decide what our beans are worth." Across the Atlantic, Brazil's president addressed a crowd in Sao Paulo's financial district. "They said we were too far apart, that Africa and South America were worlds away," he shouted over the roar. "But today the oceans bring us together. We are no longer suppliers of raw goods, we are architects of value." The crowd erupted. Fireworks painted the night sky in red and gold. By dawn, new prices for coffee were flashing across digital boards in birr, reais, and yuan. The The New York Exchange watched helplessly as trade volume dropped 30% in a single session. Inside the White House Situation Room, an advisor from the Treasury Department tried to sound calm. "It's temporary volatility, sir. We can stabilize through strategic reserves." The president cut him off. "We can't stabilize what we don't control." He turned to the National Security Council, who's whispering in their ears. "China? Russia?" "Both, sir," the NSA chief said bluntly. "China built the settlement network. Russia offered security logistics for shipping routes through the Red Sea." The president slammed his palm against the table. "So we're refinancing our own downfall every time someone buys an iPhone or a barrel of oil." Silence. The reality was too big to frame in slogans. Meanwhile, in Sao Paulo's port of Santos, the first shipment under the New Deal was being loaded. The crates bore two flags side by side, Brazilian green and Ethiopian tricolor, and a stamp reading, "Livre trade without chains." Dockworkers cheered as the cargo set sail for Shanghai. Reporters swarmed the pier. "Do you think the Americans will retaliate?" one asked a customs official. The man shrugged. "They can try. But you can't embargo sunlight, and you can't embargo taste." Back in Washington, think tank panels went into overdrive. Economists debated the implications live on television. If coffee goes non-dollar, other commodities will follow, one warned. Cocoa, tea, even oil could slip away. On social media, the conversation turned philosophical. "Maybe it's their turn," wrote one user. "We've priced their sweat long enough." At the Pentagon, a general briefed the Joint Chiefs on a different front. "We're monitoring increased Brazilian naval activity along African trade lanes. Nothing hostile yet, but they're guarding their shipments." Guarding? The president asked. "Against sabotage, sir." He exhaled slowly. "They think we'd sink coffee ships?" The general looked uncomfortable. "Sir, they think we've done worse for less." Meanwhile, on the streets of Addis Ababa, murals were appearing overnight, vivid, defiant portraits of farmers holding coffee branches like victory banners. One read, "Our beans, our power." An American journalist covering the scene wrote in her notebook, "It feels like a revolution that smells of roasted hope." In rural Ethiopia, that hope was tangible. Cooperative chairman Esfe Mengistu stood before a crowd of growers. "For years, middlemen took more than we earned. Now our beans will fund schools, roads, hospitals. The sweat on your brow finally buys you a future." Applause thundered through the valley, on the other side of the world. U.S. agribusiness executives convened in a sterile boardroom. Charts filled the screens, declining revenues, canceled orders, spiraling transport costs. One CEO said bitterly, "We spent decades teaching them efficiency. We forgot to teach them dependence." Another replied, "They learned independence instead." That afternoon, a cable arrived from the embassy in Addis. Local sentiment overwhelmingly pro-deal. Government popularity soaring. No leverage identified, the president read. It in silence, then muttered, "They found leverage. We just don't like where they put it." By midsummer, Ethiopia and Brazil had opened the Global South Coffee Exchange, a digital platform where buyers settled trades instantly in local currencies. The launch ceremony streamed live. Ethiopia's trade minister spoke into the cameras. "Every bean we sell now carries our pride with it. Every transaction reflects our independence." Brazil's envoy added, smiling, "And every cup drunk in the morning will remind them. The South is awake." In Washington, aides watched the feed in disbelief. "They've turned trade into theater," one said. "No," replied another softly, "into history." The ripple spread further. Kenya joined as an observer. Indonesia expressed interest. Even India hinted at partnership talks. The IMF issued cautious statements about financial inclusivity. But behind closed doors, Western bankers worried the model could expand beyond agriculture into minerals, energy, and manufacturing. In a late-night meeting, the president asked his Treasury secretary, "Can we undercut their prices?" "Not without subsidies we can't afford," she said. "Their production costs are lower, and now they control the benchmark. So we can't beat them, can't buy them, can't threaten them." "Not this time, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then what the hell do we do?" Outside Washington's bubble, a cultural shift was unfolding in New York and London. Began advertising Alliance coffee as ethically sourced. Customers lined up. What began as a rebellion was turning into a brand. A popular columnist wrote, "The irony is exquisite. The same nations once exploited for cheap coffee now set the premium standard." Officials toasted that headline. In Addis Ababa, they framed it.